Tonight on Nation to Nation, Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould talks reconciliation and a review of laws affecting Indigenous people.
If we were to just broadly repeal the Indian Act, the question would be what would replace it?
An Ottawa police sergeant who posted racist comments seeks redemption and reconciliation.
I realized that it was a terrible mistake to say those things, and I felt terrible about it, and I wanted to make it better and make myself better and help my community out more.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamirande, and this is Nation to Nation. Jody Wilson-Raybould is Canada's first Indigenous federal justice minister. She recently made a trip to South Africa and met anti-apartheid activist Bishop Desmond Tutu to learn more about that country's experience with truth and reconciliation. As well, Minister Wilson-Raybould chairs a working group of herself and 5 other cabinet ministers. They're reviewing the legislation that affects Aboriginal people to see if it meets constitutional obligations and international commitments. Joining me now in studio is the Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould. Minister Wilson-Raybould, welcome to Nation.
Thank you for having me.
I understand you went to South Africa at the beginning of this month, or I think it was the end of last month. What lessons did you learn from that trip?
I was very fortunate to have gone to South Africa earlier, or last month. We went down on the basis of a knowledge exchange in terms of being able to learn from the experiences that South Africa has gone through and continues to go through in terms of the development of their constitution in their post-apartheid era and their journey of nation building and reconciliation. A lot of certainly some commonalities between South Africa and Canada in terms of Indigenous peoples, and in South Africa, Black South Africans. A lot of common areas in terms of truth and reconciliation. Certainly I would
Was there anything in particular that struck you as something that was quite similar to Canada?
Well, I mean, South Africa has, incredibly different circumstances. Certainly, I would never equate the two realities. South Africa, there are 80% of Black South Africans and less than 5% of Indigenous peoples in our country. But the similarities are around nation rebuilding, around rights actualization, and seeing and listening to individuals, which I did, a diversity of individuals in South Africa, about their work of empowerment, about their work of creating social equality, and about ensuring that they are working hard to achieve the rights that are articulated in their constitution, just as Indigenous peoples and our government want to breathe life into Section 35 of our constitution.
I suppose why go all the way halfway across the planet? Why not just stay here to learn more about truth and reconciliation?
Well, I think it's very important to travel to different countries. I've had the opportunity to go to Australia and New Zealand as well to learn about the Indigenous people's experience there. I think it's important to learn from best practices, learn from the common experience that Indigenous peoples have throughout the world, and how they're dealing with reconciliation and journeys which are different, but they're also similar. And what I learned in all of those countries, including South Africa, is that we have a lot of work to do here in Canada, but our government is committed to reconciliation based on the recognition of rights and supporting however we can Indigenous communities, bringing forward their solutions to achieve their rights recognition within the Canadian Constitution.
What about yourself personally? What does reconciliation look like to you?
It's a great question. I have been fortunate in my life to work for, in some way, shape, or form, Indigenous communities. I'm very proud to come from the Muskama, Dzawadenic, and Likwita people of the west coast of British Columbia. And for me, reconciliation means ensuring or creating the space as much as we can as the Government of Canada to ensure that Indigenous peoples can be self-determining, which includes self-government, and to ultimately create the space to improve the quality of life for Indigenous peoples and to have practicing and thriving cultures.
Now, I guess along the lines of trying to improve the quality of life, you started, or you're chair of a working group of you and 5 other ministers. And so tell me a little bit more about it. Are you looking at any particular law to start with, for example, the Indian Act?
Well, I'm very pleased to have been asked by the Prime Minister to chair the working group of ministers to review laws and policies and operational practices of the federal government with respect to Indigenous peoples in this country, the Inuit, the Métis Nation, and First Nations across Canada. And we are committed to ensuring that we take a principled approach to reconciliation. As the Prime Minister has said, that's based on the recognition of rights, which is, in my view, transformative in terms of a federal government recognizing rights of Indigenous peoples. And how we move forward, or what laws or what policies we look at, will be determined by engaging directly with Indigenous peoples themselves, and to develop work plans with all 3 distinction-based tables, and the flexibility that we have as a working group of ministers enables us to engage in many different ways.
Now, I know you've met with a few groups, First Nations. I believe you were out in Winnipeg just yesterday meeting with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. Is there some sort of timeline to meet with more groups, whether they're Métis or Inuit, and before the next election anyways, actually do something concrete?
Well, I was actually in Montreal yesterday, and I met with the AFNQL, and the previous day in Winnipeg to meet with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And I have I've had the opportunity throughout the course of my work in previous lives to meet with many Indigenous communities across the country. But as minister and as the chair of this working group, I've met with the Métis Nation, I've met with the Inuit leadership, and many other communities and organizations across the country to gain input and to get feedback in terms of priorities and how the working group can be rolled out effectively. In terms of achieving, showing progress, and the Prime Minister has talked about the need to ensure that we take this recognition of rights-based approach and to create a framework to enable Indigenous communities, when they come forward, when we engage and develop joint solutions on whatever law, policy, or practice of the federal government, that we ensure that we hear those solutions that are being brought forward by Indigenous communities and peoples, and to ensure that we put those solutions into a framework and create mechanisms and tools for our part and for our role as a federal government to ensure that Indigenous communities can proceed in a manner that they deem appropriate based on their priorities. That could include substantive measures or mechanisms to move beyond the Indian Act. Certainly there's been a lot of discussion around socioeconomic concerns. I've heard the need to review policies like the comprehensive claims policies, specific claims, but bottom line from everyone that I've spoken to is the rights recognition aspect and breathing life into Section 35 and the acknowledgement that it's a full box of rights, and it's working jointly with Indigenous peoples that will ensure that that full box of rights is actualized.
And once it's actualized, is this something that can't be undone? I'm not suggesting you're going to lose the next election, but it seems like every time we have a change in mandate or a change in government, it's like reinventing the wheel. And Indigenous groups feel like they're back at square one, especially dealing with a different government.
Well, and to reflect on some of the comments that the Prime Minister made last week when we met with the Métis Nation, we want to ensure that we put in place a framework that is a framework to empower Indigenous communities to bring their solutions forward and to work in their communities however their citizens have deemed appropriate. And I think it, for myself and thinking about my own community, want to ensure that Indigenous peoples can be empowered to achieve and reach those solutions, and that irrespective of the government, the federal government that's in place, that framework will be there. How we go about ensuring that framework stands the test of time will be a discussion that we have with Indigenous peoples as we move forward jointly. Certainly,
a lot of Indigenous peoples think the biggest roadblock to doing what you're talking about is the Indian Act itself. Which has been, of course, going back to 1969, there have been many attempts to try and repeal it or amend it or whatever. Is this something that's even on the radar of the current government? Well, I think that, I mean, I've said this publicly in many different places. I think that the Indian Act for First Nations in this country represents an impoverished notion of government. And I believe strongly in ensuring and providing, as a federal government, the space for Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, including self-government. And we will continue to have conversations around the Indian Act. I know that there have been calls to repeal the Indian Act, but we need to have this conversation with individual communities. If we were to just broadly repeal the Indian Act, the question would be what would replace it? And the only people that can answer that question are self-determining Indigenous communities across the country to determine what their core institutions of government should be. And it's our obligation as a federal government to ensure that we create the space or the mechanisms for Indigenous communities when they're ready, willing, and able to move beyond the Indian Act, that we provide them the ability to do so. Thank you, Minister, for coming in and talking to me. I appreciate it. Thank you. When we come back, racist comments by an Ottawa police officer has led to an unlikely friendship and perhaps a story of true reconciliation. Welcome back. The death of Inuit artist Annie Pootoogook was an undeniable tragedy. Her lifeless body was found in Ottawa's Rideau River last summer in what police called suspicious circumstances. But what made this worse were the comments of Ottawa Police Sergeant Chris Shire. On Facebook he said, "It's not a murder case. It could be a suicide, accidental. She got drunk and fell in the river and drowned. Who knows?" Typically, many Aboriginals have very short lifespans, talent or not. He went on to say, because much of the Aboriginal population in Canada is just satisfied being alcohol or drug abusers living in poor conditions. Veldon Coburn, an Algonquin PhD student, linked the comments to Sergeant Shire and basically outed him. Shire was disciplined but not fired and had to attend sensitivity training. But the story doesn't end there. Shire has reached out to Ottawa's Inuit community and apologized repeatedly for his comments, while Coburn became very good friends with the disgraced officer. Both of them join me in studio. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. Thanks
for having us.
I'm going to start with you, Sergeant Shire. Those were really awful words for any Indigenous person to have to read. At the time, what compelled you to post them?
I think a lot of my background in working, and I didn't have the understanding and the knowledge and the awareness of the severity of a lot of the problems that the Indigenous community faced. And biases, I think, for me, were really prominent. And I think that's something that I've gone down another road on and learned more to have more empathy and understanding, and that's what I've sought out. And I realized that it was a terrible mistake to say those things, and I felt terrible about it, and I wanted to make it better and make myself better and help my community out more. I think that's where I was at the time, for sure.
Mr. Coburn, how did you feel about finding out who made the comments? And you publicly, of course, named the sergeant.
At the time, I mean, they're actually quite common comments that we see on online comment boards. But coming from someone within the justice community, that was a little bit more of a sting too. So it was a little bit more irritating than some anonymous person or some regular Joe making the comments. So that's why the impetus behind it drove me to, I guess, maybe make the call on it.
I guess, how did you feel when you kind of got outed at the time?
Actually, I felt very I was upset at first, but I think the upset turned into a more positive thing because I didn't feel any animosity towards Veldon, or I made a mistake, and with second reflection, I said this wasn't proper, and I'm missing something here, and I need to do some things in my life and in my career and in my community to make those things better. And I was actually, grateful that somebody called me out, and I was always taught to own up to my mistakes and to go forward with that. And the triumph is in trying to make things better. It doesn't negate everything you are. And I knew I had a good heart about a lot of things, and I was a productive person, and I didn't want all that to be erased. But I made a mistake, and I wanted to make amends for it, and I knew I had to.
Was there anything in particular that made you want to make amends?
I think my awareness that I was just really lacking in knowledge about the suffering over history of our Indigenous populations, and either Métis, First Nations, Inuit, and the more I started to read and learn about, I realized how much as a Canadian and as a citizen, and as a police officer, community member, that I didn't really know, and I really felt quite shocked at everything that I was learning that was history, and ashamed in a lot of ways that I didn't know all this, based on the way I'd lived. And maybe that's just a circumstance of the way you grow up, but I think it taught me that we all have to take more responsibility to seeking out answers and learning of those things, as citizens.
Mr. Coburn, what did you see in the sergeant that made you not only reach out to him but befriend him? I think I saw on your Twitter feed, your pinned tweet is a picture that he took on a trip to Newfoundland.
Yeah, I think because I had heard stories circulate through the Inuit community here that Chris has immersed himself within and becoming embraced by Inuit individuals, the leaders, national leaders. Nate Nobad has met with him.
Yes.
The elders have spent time with him, and it wasn't just someone who made a mistake and just walked away from it, but took responsibility. And as you just said, it was something they wanted to learn from. And I've made mistakes throughout my entire life, and I've learned from them. But I think Indigenous people want something more from their police officers that we haven't quite seen, because we've 20, 30 years of inquiries, Stone Child in Saskatchewan, that hasn't led to anything of making amends. And then you see it coming from Chris, who has immersed himself in it and has made wholehearted attempts to not just mend the broken relationship, but to make it better than it was in the first place. And when we talk about reconciliation from both sides, I think that's what we want from our police officers, from people who hold this particular stature in society.
I suppose if you hadn't been outed by Mr. Coburn, wouldn't your views about Indigenous people have remained the same to this day? I mean, and how do you handle it when Indigenous people just reject your overtures and say, hey, this guy should have been fired?
I certainly understand that people will be angry, and that not everybody's going to be accepting of an apology or my efforts, and I understand that, and I respect that. I think that's what healing is. I think over time, we all have to show that we want to make things better, and hopefully that'll bring some people around. And I think certainly I would have hoped that with the prominence of truth and reconciliation issue and murdered and missing women and whatnot, that we all would seek that knowledge. And I think as a police officer, especially you deal with a lot of crisis, so I think to know the roots of those crises and whatnot is important. So that's where I've found it very much more positive to go down that path, for sure.
Do you feel you would have still had the same views, though, if this hadn't have happened?
No, I think I think it's a balance for me as a police officer dealing, in my area that I deal with a lot of tragedy and whatnot. Your emotions get suppressed a lot, because to function properly, you have to suppress those emotions, and I think that's harmful. I think there has to be a balance there, and you're always trying to work on a balance, even as a veteran officer, and so that's something that for me that was a work in progress, and sometimes it's better than others, for sure. But I've been blessed that it's gone more positive paths, and that I'm much happier in the empathy aspect of it than I was before, for sure. And much more proud of that. So.
And we kind of touched upon it, I think you did, Mr. Coburn, that there's been a lot of friction between Indigenous people and police over the years. I guess what can this story tell us about, when we talk about reconciliation, what can this story tell us?
Oh, geez. I mean, I was struggled to find examples that are similar to Chris's, where mending and rebuilding and improving the relationship had occurred. But it does tell us that it is possible, that those who have an open heart and an open mind, like Chris has demonstrated, because it was the complete opposite of what I expected, but it is possible, and that these diverse communities can come together, especially with institutions within the justice system, such as policing as the front line, and that there are individuals who will open their heart to Indigenous people and will say, like, let me understand you. So, and I think we've been asking for that for a long time, and for one person, we got one person to do that, and he's put in a lot of effort to do it. So it's heartwarming, and it's promising.
I suppose in a way it must be kind of scary for you to have to do this, especially when you faced a group of Inuit, I think, just a week or so ago.
Actually, I felt very, and I mentioned this to Veldon a few weeks ago, that I felt a lot of forgiveness, which has been really healing. And I mean, I would want to be the same for other people in their mistakes too. And I felt very embraced by them saying we have to go forward with better things. Let's work together. Let's educate each other. Let's learn from each other. And I've felt really blessed in that. I felt a lot of warmth from that. And I thank the communities for that. It's I haven't felt animosity really. I've wanted to try to learn more, and I think, like I say, I don't expect everybody to embrace that right away, but it's been very positive. Yeah, it's been an amazing experience for me, and I'm just overjoyed with the way things are going. I'm very happy about it, for sure.
And very, very quickly, we're almost out of time. One last question: how do you think this will affect how you perform your police work as you go forward?
Well, it certainly will increase my empathy for different situations, and like I mentioned before, that's a balancing act, because I have to be not robotic, but fairly disconnected with a lot of emotions. It's time to do my job properly, and but I think the balancing, that emotion and learning about roots of trauma and where things come from, I think is healthier for me, and that's going to actually make me more productive and make me much more competent and understanding for my community, which I'm really immersed in and I love. So.
And one last thing before we have to sign off. After this all kind of blows over and I suppose calms down a bit, do you think you guys will still be friends?
Yeah,
it's all said and done?
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope so.
Yeah.
I think we have a bond now that is good. I'm just overjoyed with it, and it's come together, and
like I said,
feel very blessed. And
I've explained it as something kindred now. Yeah, it's something that we share that changed both our lives. It's improved me as a person.
And me, lots.
Okay, on that note, then I'm going to say thank you for coming in and doing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have. Next week, not only will Jorge Barrera be back in the host chair, our political panel will be back in action. I'm Todd Lamirande. Have a great evening.